He looked like any other quiet rancher, weathered hands, worn boots, a man who spoke only when necessary. But when Silas Ward saw his maid limping across the kitchen that morning, what he discovered would shake the sheriff's office to its core. The ranch house sat in the valley like it had been carved from the earth itself, all weathered wood and honest labor. Silas had built it with his own hands 15 years back, every beam placed with the same careful attention. He gave everything in his life. He believed in simple things, hard work, fair wages, and keeping your word. The kind of man who paid his help on time and never asked questions about where they came from. Mercy Whitmore had shown up 3 months ago, hat in hand and desperation in her eyes. Young, maybe 20, with the kind of tired look that spoke of troubles beyond her years. She needed work, he needed help keeping the house, and that was arrangement enough for both of them. She kept to herself, did her job well, and Silas respected that. In his experience, people who talked less usually had more worth listening to when they finally opened their mouths. But this morning was different. Silas had come in from checking the cattle, boots heavy on the wooden porch when he caught sight of her through the window. Mercy was moving across the kitchen like each step cost her something. Her right leg dragged slightly, and every few seconds she'd pause, gripping the edge of the table or a chair back, her face tight with pain she was trying to hide. He stood there for a long moment, watching through the glass. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed something off about her movements, but today, it was worse. Much worse. The way she favored her left side, the careful way she lowered herself to pick up a dropped spoon. It reminded him of how his old horse had moved after taking a bad fall. Hurt, but trying not to show it. Silas pushed through the door, the hinges creaking their familiar greeting. Mercy straightened immediately, trying to compose herself, but he'd already seen enough. Her face went pale, and for just a second he caught something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Fear, not of him, but fear all the same. She turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of coffee with movements that were too careful, too controlled. "Morning, Mr. Ward. Coffee's almost ready." Her voice carried that same forced lightness he'd heard from injured animals, the sound of something trying to convince the world it was fine when it clearly wasn't. Silas hung his hat on the peg by the door and studied her back. The way she held her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for the coffee cups. All of it told a story she wasn't ready to share. But Silas Ward had spent enough years reading signs, weather patterns, animal behavior, the subtle language of the land, to know when something was seriously wrong. And whatever was happening to Mercy Whitmore, it was getting worse. The question was whether she was hurt from an accident, or if someone was hurting her on purpose. And if it was the latter, Silas was going to have to decide what kind of man he really was. Silas accepted the coffee cup from Mercy's trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. Her skin was cold despite the warmth of the kitchen, and he felt her flinch at the contact. Not the reaction of someone startled, the reaction of someone expecting pain. He took a sip of the coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. She kept her back to him, busying herself with unnecessary tasks at the counter, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging, the kind of frantic activity that came from wanting to disappear without actually leaving the room. "Mercy," he said quietly. She stiffened, her hand stilling on the cloth she'd been using to wipe the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time. "Yes, sir? You're hurt." It wasn't a question, and they both knew it. The silence that followed stretched between them like a held breath. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the distance, its song bright and careless in the morning air. Inside the kitchen, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the mantel and the whisper of Mercy's uneven breathing. When she finally turned to face him, Silas saw something that made his jaw tighten. Her lip was split on the left side, the cut fresh enough that it hadn't fully healed. A yellowing bruise spread across her cheekbone, mostly hidden by the way she kept her hair pulled forward. But it was her eyes that told him everything he needed to know. They held the dull resignation of someone who'd stopped believing that things could get better. "I fell," she said, the words coming out too quickly. "Clumsy of me. Tripped over my own feet coming down the stairs yesterday evening." Silas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. He'd heard enough lies in his life to recognize the sound they made. This one fell flat in the air between them, as hollow as an empty grain silo. "Show me these stairs," he said. Mercy's face went white. "Sir? The stairs you fell down. I'd like to see them." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. They both knew there were no stairs in the small cabin where she stayed, just behind the main house. It was built on level ground, with a single step up to the front door. Silas had built that cabin himself, same as everything else on his property. He knew every inch of it. The lie hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, bitter and obvious. Mercy's hands twisted in her apron, and for a moment Silas thought she might tell him the truth. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with a defiance that would have been admirable if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "I should get back to my work," she said. Silas watched her turn away again, noting how she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who knew exactly how much movement would bring pain. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't the first time. The way she held herself, the practiced way she hid her injuries, this was the behavior of someone who'd learned to survive by staying quiet and staying hidden. But as Mercy limped toward the pantry, Silas Ward made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out who was hurting his employee, and when he did, that person was going to learn what happened when you crossed a man who'd spent his whole life believing that protecting what was his wasn't just a responsibility, it was a sacred duty. The only question now was whether the truth would be worse than he was prepared to handle. That afternoon, Silas found himself doing something he'd never done before, watching his own property like a stranger might be lurking in the shadows. He positioned himself near the barn where he could see the path that led from town to Mercy's cabin, pretending to work on a broken harness while his eyes tracked every movement across his land. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when he saw the rider approaching. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the slouched posture and swaggering gait of Deputy Vernon Briggs. The man rode like he owned every piece of ground his horse's hooves touched, his badge catching the late afternoon light with each bounce in the saddle. Silas had never cared much for Briggs. The deputy had a mean streak that ran deep as a dry well, and a way of looking at people like they owed him something just for existing. He was the kind of lawman who enjoyed the power more than the justice, and everyone in town knew it. But knowing it and doing something about it were two very different things. Briggs dismounted near Mercy's cabin and tied his horse to the post Silas had installed for visitors. But this didn't look like any kind of official visit. The deputy glanced around nervously, checking to make sure he wasn't being watched, before knocking on Mercy's door with the back of his hand, hard enough that Silas could hear the sound from 50 yards away. The door opened almost immediately as if Mercy had been waiting. From his position by the barn, Silas couldn't make out words, but he could read body language clear as print. Briggs pushed his way inside without being invited, and Mercy stepped back, her posture submissive and afraid. The door closed behind them, and Silas felt his hands clench into fists. Every instinct told him to march over there and settle this the way his father would have, with his fists and his principles. But something held him back. Maybe it was the knowledge that a confrontation with a deputy might make things worse for Mercy. Or maybe it was the realization that he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before he acted. 20 minutes passed. 20 long minutes during which Silas wore a groove in the dirt with his pacing, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. When the cabin door finally opened again, Briggs emerged first, adjusting his gun belt with the satisfied air of a man who'd gotten what he came for. Mercy appeared in the doorway behind him, and even from a distance, Silas could see that she was holding herself differently, more carefully, more pain. Briggs mounted his horse and rode off toward town without looking back, whistling a tune that carried on the evening air like an insult. Mercy stood in her doorway for a long moment, one hand pressed against the frame as if she needed it to stay upright. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. Silas stood there in the gathering dusk, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place in his mind. A deputy with too much power and not enough conscience. A young woman with nowhere to go and no one to protect her. And now he knew why Mercy had been limping. The question was what he was going to do about it. The next morning came gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low over the valley like a wool blanket. Silas had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, his mind churning through possibilities and plans. By the time dawn broke, he'd made his decision. He found Mercy in the kitchen again, moving even more carefully than the day before. She didn't meet his eyes when she served his breakfast, and he noticed she'd pulled her hair forward to cover fresh bruises on her neck. The sight of them made something cold and hard settle in his chest. "Mercy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She froze with the coffee pot halfway to his cup. "Sir? Deputy Briggs. He's been coming around here, hasn't he?" The coffee pot trembled in her hands. For a moment, Silas thought she might drop it entirely. When she finally set it down on the table, her movements were jerky and uncertain. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I saw him yesterday. I saw him come to your cabin, and I saw how you looked when he left." Silas kept his voice steady, but inside he was fighting a rage that threatened to consume him. "How long has this been going on?" Mercy's composure cracked like ice on a warming pond. Her shoulders began to shake, and when she finally looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a deputy. Who's going to believe me over him? Who's going to care what happens to someone like me?" The words came out in a rush then, like water through a broken dam. She told him about coming to town 3 months ago, running from troubles back east, about how Briggs had noticed her that first day, cornering her behind the general store with promises that turned into threats, about how he'd made it clear that she belonged to him now, whether she liked it or not. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I disappeared. Said there were mines in these mountains where nobody would ever find me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'd done it before. Silas felt something inside him go very still and very cold. He'd known Vernon Briggs was a bully and a coward, but this was something else entirely. This was evil, plain and simple. "Why didn't you leave town?" he asked. Mercy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? Where would I go? He made sure everyone knew I was under his protection. Nobody would hire me. Nobody would help me. You were the only one who'd even give me work." Silas stood up slowly, his hands flat on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire kitchen. "He's not going to hurt you anymore. Mr. Ward, you can't. He'll kill you, or he'll get the sheriff to arrest you for something you didn't do. These men, they protect each other." But Silas was already moving toward the door, his mind clear for the first time since this whole mess started. He paused with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. "There's something you should know about me, Mercy. I've never been much for talking, but I've always been real good at making sure the right thing gets done." He stepped out into the gray morning, leaving Mercy staring after him with fear and something that might have been hope warring in her eyes. The walk to town would take him an hour. That gave him plenty of time to decide exactly how he was going to handle Deputy Vernon Briggs. And one way or another, this was going to end today. The town of Cedar Falls sat in a dusty bowl between two hills, its main street lined with buildings that had seen better days. Silas walked down the center of that street with the steady gait of a man who'd made peace with what he had to do. People noticed him. They always did when Silas Ward came to town, because he only made the trip when it mattered. He found Deputy Briggs exactly where he expected to, leaning against the post outside the saloon, badge glinting in the weak morning sun, talking loud enough for half the street to hear about some poor soul he'd run out of town the week before. Briggs was the kind of man who needed an audience for his cruelty. Silas stopped about 10 feet away and waited. It took Briggs a moment to notice him standing there, and when he did, something shifted in the deputy's expression. Maybe it was the way Silas held himself, or maybe it was something in his eyes, but Briggs straightened up and let his hand drift toward his gun. "Well, well, if it isn't the hermit rancher," Briggs said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "What brings you to town, Ward? Finally ready to be sociable?" "I came to talk to you about Mercy Whitmore." The words dropped into the morning air like stones into still water. Briggs's face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, then a slow, ugly smile. "Don't know who you're talking about," Briggs said, but his eyes had gone hard and flat. "I think you do." Silas took a step closer. "I think you know her real well." The crowd was growing now, drawn by the tension crackling between the two men. Silas could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversations starting up. Good. He wanted witnesses for this. "You got something to say to me, Ward. You better say it plain," Briggs snarled, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. Silas looked around at the gathered faces. Shopkeepers, farmers, wives with children peeking out from behind their skirts. These were people who'd lived with Briggs's brutality for years, too afraid or too powerless to do anything about it. "I'm saying that you've been hurting a woman who works for me," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I'm saying that you're a coward who uses his badge to prey on people who can't fight back." The crowd went dead silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping nervously at their hitching posts. Briggs's face turned red, then purple. "That's a serious accusation, Ward. You got any proof of these lies you're spreading? Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I do, actually. The paper was blank, just something he'd grabbed from his desk before leaving the ranch. But Briggs didn't know that, and the way the deputy's eyes locked onto it told Silas everything he needed to know about how guilty the man really was. See, the thing about secrets, Silas said, unfolding the paper slowly, is that they have a way of coming to light when you least expect it. Briggs drew his gun. The gun came up fast, but Silas was already moving. 15 years of ranch work had given him reflexes like a mountain cat, and he'd been expecting this moment since he'd walked into town. He dove to the left as Briggs pulled the trigger, the bullet whining past his ear to splinter the wooden post behind him. The crowd scattered like startled birds, but Silas rolled to his feet and charged. Briggs was trying to cock his gun for a second shot when Silas's shoulder caught him in the midsection, driving them both back against the saloon wall with enough force to rattle the windows. They grappled for the gun, Briggs cursing and spitting as he tried to bring it to bear. But Silas had spent his life wrestling cattle and hauling timber, and his hands were iron from years of honest work. He twisted Briggs's wrist until the deputy cried out and dropped the weapon. The gun skittered across the wooden walkway and came to rest near the boots of Marshal Kane, who'd come running at the sound of gunfire. Kane was older than Briggs, grayer, with the kind of steady eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "That's enough," Kane shouted, his own gun drawn but pointed at the ground. "Both of you. Step back!" Silas released Briggs and raised his hands, breathing hard. The deputy slumped against the wall, clutching his wrist and glaring with pure hatred. "He attacked me," Briggs snarled. "Tried to kill me. Arrest him." But Marshal Kane was looking at the scattered crowd, reading their faces. These were people who'd lived in fear of Vernon Briggs for too long, and now something had shifted. Someone had finally stood up. "That true?" Kane asked the gathered townspeople. "This man attacked Deputy Briggs without cause?" An uncomfortable silence stretched across the street. Then slowly, an elderly woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. "Marshal," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I think there's things you need to know about your deputy." "Don't listen to her," Briggs spat. "She's crazy. They're all crazy." But more voices were joining in now. The blacksmith spoke up about how Briggs had threatened his daughter when she wouldn't accept his advances. A merchant told about money that had gone missing from his till after Briggs had searched his shop. Story after story, each one painting a picture of a man who'd used his badge as a weapon against the very people he was supposed to protect. Marshal Kane's face grew darker with each revelation. When the townspeople finally fell silent, he looked at Briggs with something like disgust. "Vernon," he said quietly, "I think you better tell me about this Mercy Whitmore." "I don't know any." "Don't." Kane's voice cut through Briggs's protest like a blade. "Don't lie to me, not anymore." Silas stepped forward, still keeping his hands visible. "Marshal, there's a young woman working at my ranch who's been terrorized by your deputy for months. She's got bruises that tell a story no decent man should have to hear." Kane studied Silas for a long moment. Everyone in the territory knew Ward's reputation, a man who kept his word and minded his own business. If he was speaking up, it meant something serious. "These are serious charges," Kane said finally. "They're lies," Briggs shouted, but his voice cracked with desperation. "You can't believe these people over a sworn officer." That's when Silas pulled out the real evidence he'd been saving, the torn piece of fabric he'd found near Mercy's cabin, fabric that matched the shirt Briggs was wearing right now. He'd picked it up that morning while Briggs was inside, and now he held it up for everyone to see. Marshal Kane looked at the fabric, then at Briggs's shirt, then back at Silas. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of justice too long delayed. "Vernon Briggs, you're under arrest." The jail cell door clanged shut behind Vernon Briggs with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire town. Marshal Kane turned the key with deliberate care, then hung it on the hook behind his desk where everyone could see it. The former deputy sat on the narrow bunk, his head in his hands, finally understanding that his reign of terror was over. "I'll need you to bring Miss Whitmore to town tomorrow," Kane told Silas as they stood outside the jail. "She'll need to give her statement officially." Silas nodded. "She'll be here." "And Ward?" Kane's weathered face was serious. "Thank you. I should have seen what was happening, should have stopped it sooner." "We all should have," Silas replied. "But it's stopped now." The ride back to the ranch gave Silas time to think about what came next. Mercy would need time to heal, time to trust that she was truly safe. But for the first time in months, she'd be able to sleep without fear. He found her sitting on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the mountains as if she was seeing them for the first time. When she heard his horse approaching, she stood up slowly, her face filled with questions she was afraid to ask. "It's done," Silas said simply as he dismounted. "Briggs is in jail. He won't be bothering you or anyone else anymore." Mercy's knees gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. For a moment Silas thought she might faint. Then the tears came, not the silent, desperate crying he'd seen before, but the kind of tears that wash away months of accumulated pain and fear. "I can't believe it," she whispered. I thought he'd always." "You thought wrong," Silas said gently. "Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and say enough." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch felt different now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Mercy had arrived. The shadow that had hung over them was finally gone. "What happens now?" Mercy asked. Silas considered the question. "Now you heal. Now you remember what it feels like to be safe. And if you want to stay on here, there's always work for someone willing to do it honestly. And if people ask what happened, let them ask," Silas said. "Truth has a way of spreading faster than lies once it gets started." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mercy Whitmore smiled for the first time in months. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. And for Silas Ward, who'd never been much for grand gestures or flowery words, that smile was worth every risk he'd taken. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns or armies, but with the simple courage to stand up when standing up mattered most. And sometimes, when a quiet rancher finally decided to speak, his voice could shake the very foundations of justice itself. The truth had set them both free. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where honor and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.